Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The second Rachel smirked and grabbed the house keys out of my hand, I knew I had to destroy her, even if it took me every ounce of patience I had been storing for the past 36 years. The funeral was barely over, the dirt on our parents' grave still fresh, and yet there she was, standing under the brittle gray sky in her neat little black dress, acting like she had just won some prize for Best Daughter of the Year. Rachel had always been that way, ever since we were kids, first to speak, first to volunteer, first to tattle on me if I so much as breathed wrong. I stood there, watching her fake her grief for the neighbors, wringing her hands delicately like she was starring in some cheap soap opera, while inside I felt my hands clench into fists so tight I could feel my nails digging little half-moons into my palms. But I didn't say a word, because in our family, the first one to scream always lost. And hell if I was going to lose again. Not this time, not after everything. Rachel turned to me after charming the funeral director with that sickly sweet voice she always used when she wanted something, and without asking, without even hesitating, she reached for the keys our parents had left behind, right there in the lawyer's envelope. She cocked her head in that way she always did when she wanted to pretend she was being kind, and said, "You're too irresponsible to deal with this, Holly. It's better if I take care of the house." For a second, I almost laughed right in her face, because the irony was so thick you could have sliced it with a butter knife. Irresponsible? This coming from the same woman who had driven our mother into an early grave with her endless demands for perfection, her criticisms so sharp they left scars you couldn't see unless you knew exactly where to look. But I didn't laugh. I just smiled, a slow, cold smile that felt like it was stretching my face in ways it hadn't in years, and I handed her the keys like I was handing her a loaded gun. "Sure," I said, my voice syrupy and bright, the way you talk to a child who's about to touch a hot stove. "Knock yourself out, wretch." I didn't tell her about the other envelope tucked neatly inside my purse, the one I had guarded like it was made of gold since the night I found it hidden inside Mom's old recipe box, wedged between yellowing newspaper clippings and a stack of unpaid utility bills Rachel had probably never even noticed. I didn't tell her that the house wasn't hers to command, that for once in my godforsaken life, I was the chosen one. No, I decided to let her build her little castle of lies first, nice and tall, so it would hurt that much more when it all came crashing down. We walked back to the cars in stiff silence, the kind of silence that crackles with all the things you want to scream, but no you can't. Rachel's heels clicked arrogantly against the cracked asphalt, while I let my battered sneakers scuff along the gravel, feeling the familiar sting of being the disappointment, the black sheep, the screw-up. But this time, there was something different under my skin, something hot and pulsing and fierce. This time, I wasn't the one who was going to end up looking stupid. As she fumbled with the car keys, still juggling the house keys triumphantly in her manicured hand like some kind of victory trophy, I dug into my purse and pulled out the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, dense with all the weight of secrets and broken promises. I tapped it lightly against the roof of her shiny black SUV, the one she had leased on our father's co-signed credit and never paid off. "By the way," I said, voice light as air, "you might want to take a look at this before you start redecorating." Rachel frowned, clearly annoyed that I was still talking, and snatched the envelope from my hand with the same entitled greed she had shown since we were kids fighting over Christmas presents. She tore it open right there in the parking lot, the wind tugging at the edges of the paper, and for a split second, I saw the exact moment her face froze, like someone had poured a bucket of cold water over her soul. There, in black and white, our parents' true final wishes. And right there, bold and unmissable, my name highlighted like a goddamn neon sign. I watched her jaw work up and down like she was trying to chew words that wouldn't come out. She opened her mouth to argue, to shout, to call me names I'd heard 100 times before, lazy, selfish, reckless, but nothing came. Because the truth, written in our mother's careful cursive, was undeniable. I turned on my heel before she could find her voice, walking away slow, giving her plenty of time to stew in it. I didn't need to see her reaction to know exactly what it looked like. And as I pulled out of that cracked lot, gravel spitting under my tires, I allowed myself one deep, satisfying laugh, the kind that bubbles up from your gut and makes you feel almost drunk with the pure, savage joy of it all. For the first time in my life, Rachel had nothing left to take from me. But little did she know I had only just begun. For the next few days, I let Rachel strut around like some smug little dictator, believing the world belonged to her just because she had grabbed the keys first. And honestly, it was almost entertaining to watch the way she paraded around like a queen newly crowned by some divine right none of the rest of us had ever agreed to. I kept my mouth shut, smiling just enough to make her think I was being gracious in defeat, nodding along as she made plans about gutting that ugly old kitchen and turning Mom's sewing room into a yoga studio, as if the walls themselves weren't still heavy with the ghosts of our childhood. The first time she unlocked the front door, she turned to me with that condescending little tilt of her chin and said, "You should be grateful I know what I'm doing, Holly." As if she was doing me a favor by stealing the one place that still smelled faintly of Dad's aftershave and Mom's burnt coffee. I wanted to tell her that she was standing on a trapdoor and that any second now it was going to swing open right under those expensive shoes she had probably charged to her husband's emergency fund. But instead, I just gave her a sweet little smile and said, "Whatever you say, Ratch, because sometimes the best revenge is letting someone dig their own grave without ever lifting a shovel." I wandered through the house behind her, letting my fingers trail along the battered banister, the one Dad built with his own two hands back in 1965, a year before Rachel was even born. I could still remember the night he put the final coat of varnish on it, swearing under his breath because he spilled a little on the carpet and Mom was going to kill him for it. Rachel didn't remember things like that because Rachel didn't remember anything that wasn't about Rachel. To her, the house was just another asset, another trophy she could brag about at brunch, while to me it was the last place where the idea of family had ever still meant something, even if it was a broken, tired version of it by the end. She started taking notes on her phone, listing all the upgrades she wanted to make, using that sterile HGTV voice like she was narrating some home renovation show where the heart of the place didn't matter as long as the backsplash was trendy enough. I let her have her moment because the fall is always worse when you climb higher first. At one point, she opened the pantry and made a face like she'd found a dead rat, muttering something about old people hoarding junk, and it was everything I could do not to slam the pantry door on her manicured hands right then and there. Instead, I stepped over to the living room where the framed photo of our parents on their 25th wedding anniversary still hung slightly crooked, just like Dad had put it up after 3 beers and one too many'll do it tomorrow's. I traced the edge of the frame lightly with my thumb and thought about that night last year when Mom sat me down at the battered kitchen table and told me about the real will, the one she and Dad had drawn up quietly, away from Rachel's meddling. The one where they decided to leave the house to me because, as Mom said, "You're the only one who remembers what this place meant." Rachel didn't know about that conversation, of course. She didn't know about the letter Mom tucked into the recipe box or the notarized documents Mom had somehow managed to get signed between chemo treatments and physical therapy appointments. Hell, Rachel didn't even notice when Mom stopped inviting her to Sunday dinners 6 months before she died. I leaned against the doorway and said, mostly to myself but loud enough for Rachel to hear, "You know, Mom died in 1946 when she was 20 years old," and Rachel snorted dismissively without even looking up from her Pinterest app. Of course, that was wrong. Mom was born in 1946, not dead by then. But I figured the mistake would be obvious enough that anyone really paying attention might catch it and wonder how 2 grown women could be so casually cruel to each other without even noticing the facts anymore. Rachel waved her hand dismissively and said, "Whatever, Holly, you never were good with details," and I bit back a grin so wide it almost cracked my face, because, my dear sister, details are exactly what is going to ruin you. Later that evening, while Rachel was busy ordering overpriced custom paint samples and plotting the demolition of everything that made the house a home, I got a call from Mr. Larson, Dad's old lawyer. The one Rachel thought she had snowed into backing her little coup. She tried to file the paperwork, he said, his voice dry with the kind of exhausted patience only an old country lawyer can master, but there's a, shall we say, complication. I assume you know what that might be. I leaned back on the couch, letting the soft creak of the old springs fill the silence before answering. Yeah, I said, picking a bit of lint off my jeans. I might have an idea. Because while Rachel was busy repainting memories and steamrolling the past, I had planted a bomb right under her, and all I had to do now was sit back and wait for the detonation. And believe me, I had waited long enough for this moment. It did not take long for Rachel's castle to start crumbling under its own fake grandeur, and watching it happen was sweeter than anything I could have cooked up deliberately, though I'll admit I did throw a few extra logs on the fire just to keep the show interesting. At first, Rachel walked around with her usual swagger, talking fast and loud about putting the house on the market immediately and getting it appraised properly, as if she could manifest ownership through sheer arrogance alone. But you could see the first cracks around her mouth when Mr. Larson politely but firmly informed her that the paperwork she had so eagerly filed had been rejected. Apparently, the title on the house was not as clean as she thought, and the city records now showed a hold placed due to pending familial clarification, which was a polite legal way of saying, someone here is lying through their teeth. Rachel tried to play it cool at first, smoothing her hair back and smiling her brittle politician's smile, but underneath that thick layer of forced charm, you could see the panic starting to creep up her spine like ivy strangling an old oak tree. She came at me one evening while I was sitting on the crumbling front steps, sipping a bad gas station coffee and tossing pebbles into the dying flower bed by the porch. She stormed up the walkway like a hurricane in 4-inch heels, waving her phone in one hand and a manila folder in the other, her face twisted into the kind of fake smile that only shows up when someone is about 2 seconds from screaming. "Did you do something, Holly?" she said, voice tight enough to snap in half, and I blinked up at her like a confused golden retriever, as innocent as the day I was born. "Me?" I said, widening my eyes. "Do what?" "You said you had everything under control." Rachel made a strangled sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a growl, flipping open the folder and jabbing a perfectly manicured finger at the highlighted sections of the city paperwork, but all I did was shrug and sip my coffee, pretending not to see how her hands were starting to shake. I knew the pressure was getting to her, knew it like I knew the sun would set tonight and rise again tomorrow, because Rachel had always been a delicate thing underneath all that armor, a girl who needed the world to admire her just to keep breathing. Meanwhile, I made myself a regular visitor to the house, wandering in and out like a stray cat nobody could quite get rid of, each time leaving behind tiny little inconveniences that seemed too small to be deliberate but too irritating to ignore. One day, she found all the cabinet doors in the kitchen open, every single one hanging wide like gaping mouths, and swore up and down she had closed them the night before. Another day, the thermostat mysteriously changed itself to 82 degrees overnight, baking the house into a sticky, unbearable sauna by morning. And once, my personal favorite, she discovered that all the labels on her brand new moving boxes had been switched around. Kitchen became basement, bedroom became garage, books became trash, small, petty things that didn't damage anything, but sure as hell frayed her nerves. The thing about Rachel was that she couldn't live with chaos. Even a little disorder gnawed at her like rats behind the walls, and it was only a matter of time before she started losing control in ways she couldn't hide. Her perfect suburban Facebook posts started dwindling, no more carefully curated photos of smiling kids and farm-to-table dinners, and instead there were long gaps followed by cryptic, passive-aggressive quotes about betrayal and trusting the wrong people. By the time her husband, Dave, showed up at the house for a family meeting, his face drawn tight with frustration, It was clear the shine on Rachel's perfect little life was wearing off fast. I listened from the top of the stairs while they fought in the living room, their voices hissing and snapping like static through a broken radio, catching bits and pieces. "You said it was handled. We can't afford another mess. I'm sick of covering for you." And each fragment was like music to my ears. Rachel caught me smirking from the landing and hissed at me later that night, eyes wide and wild. "You think this is funny? You're sabotaging me, aren't you?" I tilted my head, all wide-eyed innocence again, and said, "Rachel, you're doing a pretty good job of that all on your own." That was the final straw for her brittle little ego, and she exploded in a fit of rage I hadn't seen since we were teenagers fighting over who got to use the car on prom night. "I'm taking you to court," she screamed, voice cracking in a way that told me she knew, deep down, she was already losing. "You're trying to steal what's mine, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." I sipped my coffee and said nothing, because the best part about the truth is that it doesn't need you to defend it. It just waits, like a loaded gun tucked behind your back, patient and deadly. And Rachel, bless her heart, had just volunteered to pull the trigger herself. The courthouse smelled exactly like I thought it would, like stale coffee, cheap wood polish, and the slow, desperate sweat of people who knew they were about to lose something important. And as I sat there in the hard plastic chair outside the courtroom door, I could almost taste the bitterness radiating off Rachel, where she sat 3 seats away, pretending not to look at me while her lawyer whispered urgently into her ear. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my old car, and her hair was twisted into one of those severe, no-nonsense buns that screamed, "I am the responsible one here," but no amount of tailoring or hairspray was going to save her now. Rachel had filed the suit 3 weeks earlier in a fit of blind rage, swearing up and down that I had forged the will, manipulated our parents, or somehow tricked her out of what was rightfully hers, and for a while, I let her believe she had a shot. Let her dump money we both knew she didn't have into legal fees and court filings, all the while sitting back and letting the slow grind of justice sharpen my blade for me. The thing about Rachel was that she never saw the long game coming. She was always too busy winning the first 5 minutes to realize she was already losing the next 5 years. The bailiff called our case, his voice flat and bored like this was just another sad family squabble he would forget by lunchtime, and we shuffled into the courtroom, Rachel stiff and tight in her high heels, me walking slow and easy in my scuffed-up boots, feeling like the only one in the building who actually had time to enjoy the view. Rachel's lawyer, a thin, wiry man with sweat stains already blooming under his arms, started off strong, painting Rachel as the dutiful daughter left to clean up the mess left by a negligent sibling, and for a while, I let them talk. Let them weave their little fantasy about how I had always been the screw-up, the irresponsible one, the wild child who couldn't be trusted with anything more valuable than a coffee cup. Rachel kept sneaking glances at me from across the aisle, her lips curled into a smug little smile that said she already thought she had this thing wrapped up. Like maybe the judge would just look at me and decide on principle that someone like me couldn't possibly be telling the truth. When it was my turn, I stood up slow, feeling the weight of every single moment that had led to this day settle onto my shoulders like an old, familiar coat. I pulled the real will out of my bag, the one Mom and Dad had notarized months before they died, the one with 2 witnesses and a goddamn seal so official it practically shined under the courtroom lights, and I handed it over to the judge without saying a word. Because sometimes the best thing you can do is let the facts speak louder than any angry mouth ever could. The judge, an older woman with a face carved deep by decades of listening to liars, took her time reading the document, flipping through the pages with a careful patience that made Rachel visibly squirm in her seat, her foot tapping out a frantic rhythm against the polished floor. When the judge finally looked up, she adjusted her glasses and said, voice even and clear, according to this will, the property in question was left solely to Holly Mitchell, with no shared ownership or conditions attached. You could have heard a pin drop in that room, the silence so heavy it felt like a punch to the gut, and for a second, I thought Rachel might actually faint right there in her $1,000 shoes. Her lawyer blanched, opening his mouth to argue, and then snapping it shut again when the judge gave him a look sharp enough to slice bread. Rachel, of course, couldn't leave it alone. She jumped up, hands flailing, voice rising into that shrill pitch she always hit when things didn't go her way, shouting about fraud and betrayal and how I had manipulated our sick parents into changing their will, how none of it was fair. How she had earned that house by being the good daughter while I ran off and lived like some kind of hippie bum. The judge listened for about 30 seconds before holding up a hand and cutting her off mid-rant, her voice cold enough to freeze blood. Ms. Mitchell, unless you have evidence to support these accusations, I suggest you sit down and compose yourself. Rachel sat, but it wasn't a graceful surrender. She collapsed into her chair like a puppet with its strings cut, her face pale and crumpled, her mouth working silently like she was trying to chew through all the things she couldn't say without choking on them. I stood there, feeling the victory settle around me, heavy and strange, not the bright, burning triumph I thought it would be, but something slower, something that tasted almost like sadness. Because winning meant admitting that all those years of hoping Rachel would change were nothing more than wasted time. The judge wrapped things up quickly after that, confirming my sole ownership and dismissing Rachel's claims without so much as a backward glance, and then it was over, just like that. All the shouting and crying and posturing boiled down to one signed judgment and a few dry words scribbled into the court record. Rachel stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me, her heels clacking furiously against the tile like gunshots, her head bowed low so she wouldn't have to see the faces of the strangers who had just witnessed her fall from grace. I stayed behind for a minute, gathering my things slow and deliberate, giving her a long enough head start that I wouldn't have to pass her in the hall, because even after everything, there was a part of me that still pitied her, still hated seeing her stumble. Even if she had spent her whole life making damn sure I did exactly that. But as I stepped out into the gray afternoon light, the weight of the courthouse doors swinging shut behind me like the closing of a tomb, I couldn't help but wonder if this was really the end, or if Rachel, stubborn and bitter as ever, was already planning her next move somewhere inside that broken mind of hers. Something told me the war wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The house sat heavier than ever when it was finally, officially mine, its old bones creaking and sighing in the afternoon heat, as if even the walls themselves knew that something important had been lost here, something no deed or courtroom stamp could ever bring back. I wandered through the empty rooms with the keys dangling from my fingers, listening to the hollow echo of my own footsteps on the scratched wooden floors, and for the first time in weeks, there was no Rachel shouting, no lawyers arguing, no fake smiles or courtroom drama, just silence so thick it pressed against my skin. I had thought it would feel better than this, standing there victorious, holding the keys to a house that was now legally and completely mine, but instead of the rush of satisfaction I had imagined 100 different ways, there was only a dull ache, like pressing on a bruise you forgot you had until your fingers found it again. The air inside the house smelled faintly of dust and faded memories, the way it used to smell when Mom would open all the windows on a warm spring day, trying to chase out the mustiness of winter, but no matter how wide you threw the windows open now, there was no getting rid of the sadness woven into the very fabric of the place. I moved room to room, each one holding 1,000 ghosts that whispered at the edges of my memory whether I wanted them to or not. In the living room, where Dad used to fall asleep in his recliner with the TV blaring some god-awful fishing show he never really watched. In the kitchen, where Mom's coffee pot still sat like she had just stepped out for groceries and would be back any minute to scold me for leaving a spoon in the sink. Even upstairs in the tiny bedroom Rachel and I used to share before she got too old to bunk with her baby sister, the pink wallpaper now faded and peeling, there was a sense of time stretched thin like a rubber band about to snap. I ran my hand along the banister Dad built, the varnish worn smooth by decades of hands sliding over it, and wondered if maybe winning wasn't the thing I had needed all along. Maybe it had just been the fight that kept me going, the sheer stubborn refusal to be trampled under Rachel's designer boots one more damn time, and now that it was over, there was nothing left but the wreckage. I knew Rachel wasn't done. Not really, not deep down. Even as she had stormed out of the courtroom, rage and humiliation radiating off her in waves, I could see it in her eyes, the cold, calculating way she was already rewriting the story in her head, already plotting how to come at me from some new angle. Rachel didn't lose gracefully. Hell, she didn't lose at all if she could help it. She just retreated, regrouped, and came back sharper, meaner, dressed in some new armor that looked different but cut just the same. I didn't know what she would do next, whether she'd find some loophole in the zoning laws or try to drag me into another lawsuit or poison the well of every neighbor and friend she could find against me, but I knew better than to think this was really over. Families like ours didn't just fall apart. They rotted from the inside out, slow and ugly, until there was nothing left but hollow shells pretending to be homes. I sat down on the front steps, the evening sun throwing long, broken shadows across the weedy lawn, and pulled a beer out of the cooler I had brought from my apartment, popping the cap off with a satisfying hiss. I took a long pull, the cold biting and bitter on my tongue, and stared out at the street that hadn't really changed in 40 years, even if everything inside me had. There was a time, not too long ago, when I would have given anything to beat Rachel at her own game, to finally come out on top after a lifetime of playing second fiddle to her perfect, polished performances. And now that I had the paperwork and the keys and the solemn nod of a tired old judge backing me up, all I could think was that it didn't taste nearly as sweet as I thought it would. Maybe some wins are like that, I thought, dragging my boot along the cracked concrete step. Maybe some victories aren't meant to feel like parades and fireworks. Maybe they're just quiet little moments where you realize you survived something that should have killed you, and surviving, in the end, is its own kind of hollow triumph. I finished the beer, crushed the can flat between my hands, and tossed it into the empty trash bin by the door. The house loomed behind me, tall and still and waiting, as if it wasn't sure whether I belonged here either. I stood and looked up at it, feeling the old familiar pull of resentment and regret, anger and longing, the whole messy knot of emotions that came with loving something broken beyond repair. Maybe I would fix it up. Maybe I would tear it down. Maybe I would just let it sit there and rot, a monument to everything we had lost long before Mom and Dad ever left this world. I didn't know yet. All I knew for sure was that some wins taste sweet, pure sugar on the tongue, the kind you savor for years. And some wins, the ones you fight the hardest for, the ones you bleed and claw and cry over, they taste like dust, dry and bitter, catching in the back of your throat until you wonder if maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't worth the cost after all.